Your brother didn't want you there." My mother said it gently, like she was offering me tea instead of removing me from the room, and for a moment I thought I had misheard her, because I was standing in the hallway holding 3 boarding passes in one hand and my phone in the other, still open to the confirmation screen with all our names lined up neatly, mine right under theirs, exactly where it had always been, exactly where I had put it, and I remember looking down at the screen again as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense, something kinder, but they didn't, and when I looked back up, my father was already reaching for his coat, not looking at me, not asking anything, just moving forward like the conversation had already been completed somewhere else without me, like I had walked into the last sentence instead of the first, and I said, "I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand, because that is how I speak when something important is being taken away from me." Carefully, politely, as if clarity might soften the outcome, and my mother smiled in that small, composed way she uses when she believes she is being reasonable, and she said, "It's not a big deal, sweetheart, your brother just prefers to keep this trip smaller," and I nodded, because I always nod first, because I was raised to acknowledge before I respond, and I said, "Of course, I understand," even though I did not understand at all, not really, not the part where my name could be removed from a plan I created, not the part where I could be standing in my own home and suddenly feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and my father picked up his keys from the table, the same table where I had sat 3 nights earlier booking everything, comparing flights, checking seat maps, making sure they would be comfortable, making sure there were no connections that would be too tight for him, because he does not like to rush through airports, and I remember thinking about that detail, how carefully I had planned it, how I had built the entire trip around their preferences, and now I was being edited out of it like a line that didn't fit the final draft. And my brother's name stayed, of course it did, it always did, and I didn't ask where he was at that moment, I didn't ask if he had said those words himself or if they had been interpreted for him, because the answer would not change anything, and I have learned not to ask questions that only confirm what I already know, and my mother reached for her purse, and she said, "We'll call you when we land," in that same even tone, the same tone people use when they are closing a conversation they believe is settled, and I said, "That sounds good, Mom," because I have always addressed her with respect, even when I am being quietly dismissed, and she paused for just a second, like she expected something else from me, maybe disappointment, maybe protest, something louder, something easier to categorize, but I didn't give her that, I just stood there with the tickets still in my hand, and my father opened the front door, and the morning air came in, cool and clean, carrying that early travel energy people have when they are about to go somewhere together, and I stayed where I was, because no one had asked me to follow, and no one had said I could not, but the space between those two things was already filled with something final, and I watched them walk down the driveway, my mother adjusting her scarf, my father checking his watch, moving in sync the way people do when they share a plan, and I realized then that the plan no longer included me, not in the way that matters. Not in the way that gives you a seat at the table or a place in the car or a name on the boarding pass that actually gets used, and I looked down at the 3 tickets again, and for a moment I considered calling the airline, fixing it, putting my name back where it belonged, because technically, I could, everything was still under my account, still within my control, but I didn't, I just folded the papers once, neatly, the way I do everything, and I set them on the table beside the keys my father had just taken, and I said, softly, to no one in particular, "I hope the trip is exactly what you wanted," and the house was very quiet after that. Quieter than it should have been, like it was holding on to the echo of something that had already left, and I stood there for a long time, longer than necessary, longer than anyone would have noticed, because there was no one there to notice, and that was the part that stayed with me, not the words, not even the decision, but the absence of hesitation, the ease of it. The way a place can be taken from you without anyone raising their voice, and I remember thinking, very clearly, very calmly, that this was not the first time I had been left behind, just the first time they had said it out loud. I did not move right away after they left, not because I was waiting for them to come back, but because I wanted to understand exactly what had just happened, and I have learned that understanding takes stillness, so I stood there with my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, looking at the tickets I had printed, at the neat alignment of names and times and gate numbers, all the small details that usually make me feel in control, and I said quietly, "All right," not as agreement, but as acknowledgment, because there is a difference, and I care about those differences, even when no one else does. And after a few minutes I picked up my phone and opened the booking again, scrolling through the itinerary the way I do when I am checking for errors, except this time I was not looking for mistakes, I was looking for patterns, and patterns have always been easier for me to read than people, and the pattern here was simple. I had organized the entire trip, I had paid for it, I had confirmed every detail, and yet somehow I was the only part of it that could be removed without consequence, and that told me something. Not about logistics, but about position, about where I stood in this structure that we still called a family, and I set the phone down carefully and walked to the kitchen, because routine helps me think, and I poured a glass of water even though I was not thirsty, and I took a sip and placed it on the counter exactly where I always do, and I said, almost as if I were explaining it to someone else. They made a decision before this morning, because people do not usually make choices like that on the spot. Not ones that require coordination and confidence and a shared story, and the more I considered it, the more it became clear that I had been included in the planning stage, but not in the final version, which meant there had been a moment, somewhere between the booking and the departure, when my presence became optional, and I did not ask when that moment was, I asked why I did not see it, and the answer came easily, because I was focused on making everything work, and when you are the one making things work, you often do not notice when you are no longer needed, and I allowed myself a small smile at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was accurate, and accuracy has always been more useful to me than comfort, and my phone buzzed on the counter, a message from my mother, we are almost at the airport, traffic is light, and I read it once, then again, noting the tone, neutral, efficient, as if we were still aligned, as if I were simply running late instead of being removed, and I typed back, I am glad you made good time, please let me know if you need anything, and I meant it, because my sense of responsibility does not disappear just because my role has been reduced, and I placed the phone face down and walked back to the hallway, where my suitcase was still standing upright, closed, ready, a small detail that suddenly felt unnecessary, and I rested my hand on the handle for a moment, then let it go, because there was nowhere for it to go anymore, at least not today. And I sat down on the edge of the stairs, not out of exhaustion, but because I wanted a different perspective, and from there I could see the front door, the table, the tickets, all the pieces of the morning arranged in a way that made the sequence clearer, and I said, softly, this is not about the trip, because it never is, not really, and as soon as I said it, I felt something settle into place, a kind of quiet alignment between what I had experienced before and what had just happened, birthdays where plans changed without me. Events where my seat was given away, conversations that ended just before I spoke, small things, individually insignificant, but consistent, and consistency is what turns moments into patterns, and patterns into conclusions, and I have always trusted conclusions that are built slowly, because they tend to hold, and my phone buzzed again, this time a notification from the airline, check-in available, and I looked at it for a moment, considering the option it represented, the version of the day where I simply went anyway, where I appeared at the gate with my passport and my calm voice and said, there seems to have been a misunderstanding, and perhaps there had been, perhaps that is what they would say if I showed up, but I did not move, because I am not interested in forcing my way into places where I have been deliberately excluded, not anymore, and I turned the notification off and set the phone aside, and I said, with the same steady tone I use when I am finalizing something important, if I am not expected, I will not arrive, and it was not a declaration, it was a decision, and decisions, when they are made correctly, do not need to be announced, they simply change what happens next. There are moments when silence is not empty but precise, and this was one of them, because everything I needed to understand was already in front of me, not hidden, not complicated, just arranged in a way that required attention, and I have always been very good at paying attention, so I closed the laptop halfway, not fully, just enough to signal that I was not finished, and I picked up my phone again, reading Daniel's message one more time, the phrasing, the assumption, the expectation that I would be present, and I said quietly, they are waiting for me, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and I stood up from the table and walked back to the hallway where my suitcase was still waiting, exactly as I had left it, upright, composed, ready, and I rested my hand on the handle again, this time not to consider whether I should go, but to acknowledge that I could, and that distinction matters, Because being excluded is not the same as being unable, and I do not confuse those two things anymore, and I turned away from the suitcase and walked to the window instead, looking out at the empty driveway, the absence still fresh, still recent, and I said, they made their version of the plan, and then, after a brief pause, I will make mine, because plans are not owned by the loudest voice, they are shaped by the person who understands them fully, and in this case, that was still me. And I returned to the table and opened my laptop again, this time all the way, and I began to move through the documents with a different kind of focus, not correcting, not adjusting, but evaluating, and I opened the email thread connected to the meeting, scrolling through the exchanges between myself and the firm, noting the timestamps, the confirmations, the language that consistently addressed me as the point of contact, the person responsible for aligning expectations, and I noticed something else. Something small but important, the final confirmation had been sent directly to me, not to my father, not to my brother, to me, and I said softly, that was intentional, because organizations do not make that kind of choice by accident, they assign responsibility where it belongs, and responsibility, when recognized externally, carries weight that internal dynamics cannot easily override, and my phone buzzed again, this time not a message, but a call, the same unknown number. And I watched it for one ring, then two, allowing the moment to settle before I answered. Because timing is part of communication, and when I finally lifted the phone, I said, this is Tige Monroe, clear, calm, exactly as I always introduce myself, and there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a measured voice, professional, attentive, Ms. Monroe, this is Daniel, I hope I am not catching you at a bad time, and I replied, not at all, Daniel, thank you for reaching out. Because courtesy costs nothing and returns everything, and he continued, we just wanted to confirm your arrival, we have everyone scheduled for early afternoon, and there have been a few questions about the presentation structure, and I let him finish without interruption, because people reveal more when they are not guided, and when he paused, I said, I appreciate you letting me know, there has been a slight change on our end regarding travel arrangements, and I chose each word carefully, not to obscure, but to maintain alignment with the facts, and he responded quickly, a hint of concern entering his tone, I understand, will that affect your participation today? And I looked at the open document in front of me, at my name, at the structure I had built, at the sequence that depended on my presence in ways my family had not fully considered, and I said, that depends on how we choose to proceed, because it did, entirely, and there was another pause, longer this time, and then he said, we were under the impression that you would be leading the initial segment, and I allowed that sentence to settle, because it clarified everything, not just my role, but the gap between what had been communicated and what had been assumed. And I replied, that was the original plan, yes, and I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because silence, when used correctly, invites honesty, and he spoke again, more directly now, Ms. Monroe, I want to be transparent, the team is expecting you, and your absence would change the structure of the entire session, and I nodded, even though he could not see me, because acknowledgment is not always visual, and I said, I understand the importance of continuity, Daniel, my tone steady, respectful, unchanged, and then, after a brief pause, I added, may I ask who has already arrived on your end, and he listed the names, my father, my brother, others I recognized from the thread, all present, all moving forward within a version of the plan that did not fully account for its foundation, and when he finished, I said, thank you, that is very helpful, and I meant it, because information, when given clearly, is always valuable, and I closed my eyes for just a moment, not out of uncertainty, but to align my next decision with the reality in front of me, and when I opened them again, I looked at the suitcase, at the laptop, at the phone in my hand, and I said, with quiet precision, Daniel, I will need a few minutes to finalize my approach, I will contact you shortly with a clear update, and he agreed without hesitation, of course, Ms. Monroe, we will be ready, and the call ended, and the room returned to its quiet state, but it felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but prepared, and I placed the phone down gently and said, now we begin. I have always believed that decisions reveal themselves not in what they change, but in what they leave untouched, and as I stood there with the room settled into that quiet readiness, I began to see exactly which parts of this situation had remained intact, and that told me where the real structure was, not in the flights, not in the hotel, but in the expectations that had been built around my presence. Expectations that were now waiting in a room several hundred miles away, and I said softly. They moved without understanding the framework, because that is what had happened, not out of malice, not even out of strategy, but out of assumption, and assumptions have a way of collapsing when they are tested, and I do not rush those moments, I let them develop fully, so I walked back to the table and sat down, opening the laptop once more, this time navigating to the presentation file itself. The one I had built over the past 2 weeks, slide by slide, detail by detail, aligning not just information but flow, because flow determines how people receive what they are shown, and I scrolled slowly, not reviewing, but confirming that everything was still where I had placed it, that nothing had been altered in my absence, and of course it had not, because no one else had access to the structure in the way that I did, and I said, that remains, and I rested my fingers lightly on the keyboard, considering the next move, because there is always a next move, even when others believe the situation is already decided, and my phone lit up again, another message, this time from my mother, we landed safely, and I read it without emotion, not because I did not care, but because I understood the context now, and I replied, I am glad you arrived without any issues, Mom, keeping my tone consistent, respectful, unchanged, because consistency is its own form of clarity. And I placed the phone down again and returned my attention to the screen, to the file that still bore my name, still reflected my work, still held the sequence that others were now expected to follow without me, and I said quietly, that is not sustainable, because it was not in the way they imagined, and I opened a new window and began drafting a message, not to my family, not yet, but to Daniel, because alignment begins with the correct point of contact, and I typed carefully, not rushing, allowing each sentence to carry exactly the weight it needed. Daniel, thank you for your patience. I have reviewed the current situation and would like to clarify the structure of today's session before we proceed, and I paused there, considering the phrasing, because clarity is not about volume, it is about precision, and I continued, the initial segment, including the presentation framework and key discussion points, was designed to be led by me directly, as the materials and sequencing are based on my methodology, and I stopped again, reading it once, then again, ensuring that it stated only what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less, and I added, without my direct involvement, the session may not achieve its intended outcomes, and I let that sentence sit for a moment, because it was not a warning, it was an observation, and observations, when accurate, do not need to be emphasized, and I finished with, please let me know how you would prefer to proceed. I am available to support the session in a way that maintains its integrity, and I sent the message without hesitation, because hesitation suggests uncertainty, and I was not uncertain, and as the message left my screen, I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in relief, but in readiness, because I knew what would follow, not the exact words, but the direction, the shift that occurs when expectations meet reality, and my phone vibrated almost immediately, Daniel's name appearing this time instead of an unknown number, and I answered on the first ring, because timing, again, matters, and I said, Daniel, simply, clearly, and his voice came through with a different tone now, more focused, more aware, Ms. Monroe, thank you for your message, we were just reviewing the materials here, and I need to be candid, the team is having difficulty navigating the structure without your guidance, and I listened without interrupting, because I already knew this would be the case. And he continued, your father and brother are here, but they mentioned you would not be attending, and we were not aware of that change until recently, and I allowed that information to settle, because it confirmed the misalignment fully, not just internally, but externally, and I said, I understand, Daniel, my tone steady, unchanged, and then, after a brief pause, I added, it seems there has been a discrepancy between what was communicated and what was assumed, and he exhaled lightly on the other end. Not frustration, but recognition, and he said, yes, that would be an accurate way to describe it, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, and I said, in that case, we have 2 options, and I let the words land clearly, evenly, without pressure, we can proceed without me, and accept the limitations that come with that, or we can adjust the structure to ensure the session achieves its intended purpose, and I stopped there. Because options, when presented correctly, reveal priorities, and he did not respond immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about which direction this would go, And in the quiet that followed, I looked once more at the suitcase. In the hallway, still waiting, still ready, and I said, very softly, let us see what they choose. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a choice when the outcome is already understood but not yet spoken, and I recognized it immediately in the space after I presented the options, because Daniel did not respond right away, not out of hesitation, but because he was recalibrating, adjusting his expectations to match the reality that had just been clarified, and I remained still, not filling the gap, not guiding him, because clarity does not require assistance once it has been seen. And after a few seconds he spoke, his tone more deliberate now, Ms. Monroe, I believe we need to adjust the structure, and I nodded once, slowly, because that was the only direction that aligned with the purpose of the session, and I said, I agree, my voice even, measured, unchanged, and he continued, would you be available to join remotely, at least for the opening segment, and I considered the question carefully, not because I lacked an answer, but because the way I responded would define what followed, and I said, I am available to ensure the session maintains its intended structure. Choosing my words precisely, because availability and participation are not the same thing, and he understood that. I could hear it in the way his tone shifted again, more focused, more aligned. Understood, we can arrange a secure connection within the next 15 minutes, and I replied, that will be sufficient, and the call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but efficiently, because once alignment is reached, conversation becomes unnecessary, and I placed the phone down on the table and let my hand rest beside it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge the transition that had just occurred, because something had shifted, not in volume, not in emotion, but in position, and position determines how everything else unfolds, and I stood up and walked to the hallway again, stopping beside the suitcase, looking at it with a different understanding now, because it no longer represented departure, it represented choice, and I said quietly, not today, and I turned back. Toward the table, toward the laptop, toward the structure that was now waiting for me to activate it from a distance, and I sat down, opening the presentation file once more, not to review, but to prepare, because preparation is not repetition, it is alignment, and I adjusted a few elements, not the content, but the pacing, the way information would be delivered through a screen instead of in person, small shifts that most people would not notice, but that I understood would make the difference between clarity and confusion. And as I worked, my phone vibrated again, this time a short message from Daniel, connection link sent, we will begin shortly, and I opened the link without delay, because timing, again, matters, and the screen transitioned to a waiting interface, a simple prompt, host will let you in, and I watched it for a moment, noticing the stillness, the anticipation on the other side of that connection, and I said softly, they are already inside, because they were, my father, my brother, the others, all seated in a room built on a structure they did not fully understand, waiting for something they had assumed would proceed without me, and now, that assumption was about to be corrected, not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with presence, and presence, when established correctly, does not need to announce itself, it simply changes the environment, and the screen shifted, the interface opening, revealing the room on the other side, a long table, neutral lighting, familiar faces arranged in a way that suggested order but lacked cohesion, and I saw them immediately. My father seated near the center, posture composed, expression controlled, my brother to his right, relaxed in a way that suggested competence rather than awareness, and a few others positioned around them, attentive, waiting, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, because my presence had not yet been acknowledged, not fully, not consciously, and I allowed that moment to exist, because moments like that reveal more than any introduction could, and then Daniel's voice entered the space, clear, professional, thank you, everyone, before we begin, I would like to confirm that Ms. Monroe is joining us remotely to lead the opening segment, and I watched the reaction, not dramatically, not with intensity, but with quiet attention, because reactions, when observed without interference, are always precise, and I saw it in my father's slight shift in posture, the brief pause in my brother's expression, the small but unmistakable adjustment that occurs when expectation meets reality, and I leaned slightly forward, activating my microphone, and I said, "Good afternoon," my tone calm, composed, exactly as it had been earlier, exactly as it had always been, and I added, after a brief pause, "I appreciate your patience, let us begin." There is a moment when a room realizes it has been moving in the wrong direction, and it does not announce itself with noise, it shows itself in stillness, in the way people stop adjusting their papers, in the way attention sharpens without anyone asking it to, and I saw that moment clearly as the screen settled and my voice entered their space, because everything that had felt loosely held a second before now had a center again, and I did not rush to fill it. I allowed a brief pause, just long enough for the shift to register, and then I continued. "Before we begin, I would like to clarify the structure for today's session," my tone even, deliberate, the same tone I had used in every message, every call, because consistency is what establishes credibility, not volume, and I moved to the first slide, the one that outlined the framework, simple, clean, designed to guide without overwhelming, and I said, "This presentation is built in 3 segments, each one dependent on the clarity of the one before it," and I watched his eyes moved to the screen, not distracted, not uncertain, but attentive, because structure, when presented correctly, creates its own authority, and I continued, "The opening segment will establish the foundation, not just in terms of information, but in terms of alignment, and without that alignment, the following discussions will lack direction," and I paused there, not because I needed to, but because pauses allow people to recognize what has just been said, and I saw my father shift slightly in his seat, not dramatically, just enough to indicate awareness, and my brother leaned back a fraction, his earlier ease replaced with something more focused, and I did not address them directly, I did not need to, because the context was already doing that work for me, and I moved to the next slide, guiding them through the sequence I had built, each point connected, each transition intentional, and as I spoke, I felt the room adjusting, not resisting, not questioning, but aligning, because clarity removes the need for debate, and after a few minutes, I paused again and said, "Before I continue, are there any questions regarding the structure?" And I let the question sit, open, without pressure. And for a moment no one spoke, and then Daniel's voice entered, "No questions from our side, everything is clear," and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the response, and then my father's voice followed, measured, controlled, "This aligns with what we had discussed earlier," and I recognized the phrasing immediately, not incorrect, but incomplete, and I said, "I am glad to hear that, Dad," keeping my tone respectful, unchanged, and I added, after a brief pause, "The distinction today is in the execution," and I let that settle, not as correction, but as clarification, and I moved forward, guiding them through the details that required my direct input, the nuances that do not translate through summaries or assumptions, and I saw the difference in their engagement, the way attention sharpened when specifics were introduced, the way questions became more precise, more relevant, because they were now anchored in the correct framework, and at one point my brother spoke, his tone attempting to re-establish familiarity. "We could probably simplify that part, make it more flexible," and I listened fully before responding, because interruption weakens authority, and when he finished, I said, "Flexibility is valuable when the structure is already understood," my voice calm, steady. "In this case, the structure is what ensures the outcome," and I left it there, not extending the point, not defending it, because it did not require defense, and the room remained quiet for a moment before Daniel responded, "That makes sense, we will follow your lead on that," and I acknowledged it with a simple, "Thank you," because acknowledgement maintains flow, and I continued, moving through the presentation with the same measured pace, allowing each segment to build on the previous one, and as I did, I became aware of something else, something more subtle, the way my presence had not just corrected the structure of the session, but the dynamic within the room itself, because authority, when established externally, has a way of recalibrating internal roles, and I saw that clearly now, in the way my father deferred without resistance, in the way my brother adjusted without comment, and I did not react to it, I did not highlight it, because recognition does not need to be spoken to be effective, and as I reached the end of the opening segment, I paused once more and said, "That completes the foundation for today's discussion," my tone unchanged. "From here, we can move into the next phase with clarity," and I allowed a brief silence after that, not as a pause, but as a transition, and then I added, very simply, "Shall we proceed?" There is a point in every structured conversation where the focus shifts from understanding to consequence, and I recognized that transition immediately as the room moved into the next phase, because the questions changed. They became more specific, more dependent, and I allowed that to happen without interruption, guiding only where necessary, because guidance is most effective when it feels like continuity rather than correction. And as Daniel began outlining the next segment, referencing the framework I had just established, I listened carefully, not for errors, but for alignment, and when he finished, I said, "That sequence works," my tone calm, measured, "as long as we maintain the dependencies we discussed," and I watched as he nodded, taking note, adjusting in real time, and the room followed, not because they were instructed to, but because the structure now made sense to them, and that is the difference. Compliance fades, understanding holds, and I continued to observe. Allowing others to speak, allowing the conversation to expand within the boundaries I had set, and then my father spoke again, his tone steady, but carrying a different weight now. "We can move forward with this approach," and I acknowledged him with a slight nod, even though he could only see me through the screen, and I said, "That would be consistent with the intended outcome," and I left it there, because agreement does not need elaboration, and the discussion continued, each point building logically, each response aligning with the structure that had been re-established, and after several minutes, Daniel paused and said, "I think it would be helpful if we review the implementation timeline," and I responded, "Of course," and I navigated to the final section, the one that connected everything together, the part that requires not just understanding, but precision, and I said, "This timeline is not flexible in the way it might appear," my voice steady, clear. "Each phase depends on the completion of the one before it," and I paused briefly, allowing that to settle, and then I added, "If we adjust one element without considering the others, the entire sequence becomes unstable," and I watched as the room absorbed that, not resisting, not questioning, but recognizing the implication, and my brother leaned forward slightly this time, his earlier ease replaced with attention, and he said, "So we are saying there is no room for changes," and I listened fully before responding, because questions, even when simplified, deserve clarity, and I said, "There is always room for adjustment," my tone calm, "but adjustments require awareness of the full structure," and I paused, then added, "That awareness is what allows flexibility to work rather than disrupt," and I saw him nod, not fully, not completely, but enough to indicate understanding, and the conversation moved forward again, more focused now, more deliberate, and after a few more exchanges, Daniel said, "I believe we are aligned on the next steps," and I said, "That is good to hear, because alignment is the goal, not agreement for its own sake," and I allowed a brief silence, the kind that signals completion of a segment, and then I said, "Before we conclude, I would like to confirm responsibilities, because structure without ownership does not hold," and I outlined the roles clearly, each one connected to the framework, each one dependent on the sequence we had established, and when I reached my own role, I said, "I will continue to oversee the initial phases to ensure consistency," my tone unchanged, and I did not expand on that, because it did not require justification, and the room remained quiet for a moment, and then Daniel said, "That would be ideal." And I nodded, acknowledging the alignment, and as the session began to move toward its conclusion, I became aware of something else, something quieter, but no less significant, the way the dynamic had fully shifted, not just in structure, but in recognition, because now my presence was not assumed, it was required, and that distinction changes everything, and I said, "If there are no further questions, we can close this segment," and Daniel responded, "No further questions," and my father added, "This was helpful," his tone measured, controlled, and I acknowledged him with a simple, "I am glad," because acknowledgement, again, maintains balance, and I allowed one final pause before I said, "Then we are complete for now," and I moved to end the session, not abruptly, but with the same precision that had guided it, and as the screen began to transition, I caught a brief moment, a glance, my father looking toward my brother, not speaking, not reacting, just looking, and I recognized that look, not as confusion, but as realization, and I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else, "They understand now," and I ended the connection. After the screen went dark, the room returned to its original quiet, but it was not the same quiet I had started with, because this one carried resolution, not absence, and I sat there for a moment with my hand resting lightly on the edge of the laptop, not moving, not rushing to close anything, because endings, when handled correctly, should be acknowledged, not dismissed, and I said softly, "That is complete," not as a statement of finality, but as recognition of what had just been established, and I closed the laptop with a measured motion, the same way I had opened it earlier, because consistency, again, matters, and I stood up from the chair and walked back toward the hallway, toward the suitcase that had remained in the same position all day, upright, composed, waiting without expectation, and I placed my hand on the handle once more, not to lift it, but to feel its weight, to understand what it represented now, because it no longer felt like something I had been denied, it felt like something I had chosen not to carry, and I said quietly, not every invitation requires acceptance, and I let that thought settle, because it was new in its clarity, not new in its truth, and my phone vibrated again on the table behind me, and I turned, walking back slowly, not with urgency, but with awareness, and I picked it up, seeing my father's name on the screen this time, not a message, a call, and I looked at it for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but to understand the timing, because timing reveals intention, and I answered on the second ring, "Hello, Dad," my voice calm, respectful, unchanged, and there was a brief pause on the other end, longer than usual, as if he was choosing his words more carefully than he had earlier that morning, and he said, "That was well done," his tone controlled, but carrying something unfamiliar, something closer to acknowledgment than assumption, and I responded, "Thank you, I am glad the session was productive," keeping the focus where it belonged, not on recognition, but on outcome, and he exhaled lightly, not frustration, but recalibration, and he said, "We did not realize how much of that depended on you," and I listened without interruption, because statements like that are not meant to be challenged, they are meant to be understood, and I said, "It was outlined in the original structure," my tone even, not corrective, just factual, and there was another pause, and then he said, "You could have told us," and I allowed that to settle for a moment, not reacting, not defending, just observing the shift in responsibility implied by that sentence, and I replied, "I assumed it was clear, because I had, and assumptions, I have learned, are rarely shared evenly," and he did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter, more measured. "We should have handled this differently," and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because acknowledgment, when given sincerely, does not require expansion, and I said, "That would have been helpful," and I left it there, not extending the conversation into something it did not need to become, and he continued, "We can adjust the rest of the trip, if you want to join us," and I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the shift behind them, the change from exclusion to invitation, and I said, after a brief pause, "I appreciate the offer," my tone steady, unchanged, "but I will not be traveling this time," and I allowed that to settle, not as rejection, but as decision, and he was quiet for a moment before responding, "All right," and there was no argument in it, no pressure, just acceptance, and I added, gently, "Please enjoy the rest of your time there," because kindness, when given without obligation, carries more weight than agreement, and he said, "We will," and the call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but with a sense of closure that had not been present before, and I placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, looking at it, at the space around it, at the room that had held everything that had just unfolded, and I said quietly, "That is different," because it was, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but in a way that mattered, in a way that shifted how I would move forward, and I walked back to the hallway one last time, stopping beside the suitcase, and this time I did lift it, not to leave, but to move it aside, placing it back in the closet where it belonged, because not every plan needs to be completed to be understood, and as I closed the closet door, I rested my hand against it for a brief moment and said, very softly, "I was never the one who did not belong," and then I turned, walked back into the house, and let the quiet settle around me, not as something empty, but as something earned.